The ramp down into the Midtown garage was a low concrete throat that swallowed the street noise and replaced it with a soft echo of rubber on dust and the hush of stale, conditioned air. Keanu guided his old black motorcycle down the slope in second gear, engine muted to a steady hum that felt polite in a place built for echoes. Morning light thinned behind him, replaced by fluorescent strips that flickered once before staying solid, a pale promise of visibility without warmth. He eased into a spot at the far end near the cinderblock wall where a faded yellow line had been painted in a hopeful rectangle years ago and never repainted. The paint scabbed and thin like the memory of rules instead of the rules themselves. The garage was mostly empty, a handful of sedans parked nose to wall, a beat-up delivery van asleep in a corner with its side door taped shut, and by the exit booth, a silver mid-tier sedan idling like a bored dog. He killed the engine, sat still for a second to let his breathing match the quiet, and watched a dust mote wander in the beam from a humming light above. Then he swung his leg off, set the bike on its stand, and took off his helmet. The world became softer when he removed it, paradoxically less insulated. He could hear the tiny sounds, water trickling somewhere, the chitter of a loose grate, the distant lift whirring and stopping, and then the soft hiss of someone sipping coffee. He unzipped his jacket halfway, the zippers rasped long and gentle, and pulled out the canvas tote he had tucked into his left saddlebag. Its weight was pleasant, a shoulder pull that felt like purpose. Inside were used books he had picked up from a charity shop 2 blocks over, a dog-eared copy of Meditations, a paperback on motorcycle maintenance and philosophy that made him smile every time he saw it, a poetry collection with someone's neat marginalia in pencil, a scuffed thriller with a cracked spine, the kind of thing that had sat on someone's nightstand through a poor night of sleep and kept him company anyway. He laid them on the seat in a neat stack, thumbs sweeping dust from the covers, eyes flicking to the edges to judge wear and care and the invisible fingerprints of former owners. For a moment he just stood there, palm pressed lightly on the top book, breathing the garage's cold metallic breath mixed with a faint paper vanilla of old pages. He was not lingering. He was existing at the speed that made sense in an empty space. He glanced toward the booth. Inside it, a man in mirrored sunglasses reclined with the attitude of someone who had been awake longer than he wanted to be. One elbow perched on a counter beside a small fan, the other hand wrapped around a paper cup. The man was in his early 40s, hair clipped short, shirt with the garage's embroidered logo faded to a ghost of a name. On the counter, a clipboard, a greasy pastry bag, and a set of keys with a heavy fob. The idling silver sedan sat just behind the booth, aligned too carefully. Hood edge barely past the painted stop line, like a pet that had been scolded into good behavior. Keanu slid the poetry book into the tote, then the thriller, aligning their spines without thinking. He was timing himself against nothing and no one, but old habits of respect ran deep. He glanced at the posted sign on the pillar. First 15 minutes free, then smaller text listing rates, then smaller still. Please have ticket ready. He checked his watch. He had been in the garage barely 3 minutes. He used the edge of his jacket to wipe a scuff from the bike's mirror, half smiled at himself for the fussiness of the gesture, then pocketed the cloth. The motorcycle's matte black tank showed his reflection darkly, a smudged silhouette more feeling than face. He reached for the last book, Meditations, and paused on the first page where someone had underlined a sentence. You have power over your mind, not outside events. He felt the sentence land with a small satisfying click, like a key turning a lock that had always been meant for it. He dropped the book into the tote, zipped the bag, and set it gently in the saddlebag. The garage's air tasted faintly of coolant. From the booth came the soft chirp of a cell phone notification, then the distinct choke of a laugh that was more exhale than amusement. Keanu looked up. The attendant's head was turned toward his phone, thumb flicking quickly, mouth moving towards no one else could hear. Then the attendant looked over, and their eyes almost met through the mirrored lenses. A brief, neutral moment, a human check-in, a silent nod of acknowledgement hovering on the edge of reality. He reached for his helmet, felt the smoothness of its battered shell against his fingers, and stopped again, because a new sound cut through the mild morning. A voice amplified by tile and concrete into something larger than the man it came from. "Hey, you gonna set up a library over there? Or are you actually gonna leave?" The words arrived with the slap of someone throwing something light and cheap onto a countertop. The booth attendant was leaning out of his window, one forearm hanging, sunglasses pushed up just enough that his eyes were now visible and narrowed. The tone was bored, then edged, then bored again, the way people practice being in charge by practicing disdain. Keanu blinked. There was no rush of heat in him, only the faintest shift in posture, weight rolling from heel to toe and back, time stretching and thinning. He looked at the sign again, then at his watch, then at the man. He raised one hand in a small open gesture that meant, "I hear you." He said nothing yet. The attendant sighed dramatically, retreated into the booth to put his cup down, then leaned out farther. "Let's go, man. People actually need to use this place. 15 minutes free doesn't mean 15 minutes to vibe with your motorcycle." The attempt at a joke had a hook in it, a barb wrapped in casual cloth. Keanu's jaw moved once as if to relax itself, and he nodded once, slowly. He had learned to count in such moments, to 5, then back to 1, to notice his breath not as a command but as a fact. He slid the helmet under his arm and took a couple of steps toward the yellow line, toward the angle where he could speak without raising his voice and be heard without making a scene. "I'll roll out in a moment," he said, tone mild as warm water, words placed carefully on the palate of the air so they would not splinter. The attendant tilted his head, smirked as if to say he had won something by drawing out a response, and shrugged. The idling silver sedan gurgled once, a small mechanical cough, then settled. Keanu touched the handlebar lightly, like making a promise to an object that had kept him honest longer than most people had known him. The garage swallowed a new breath and held it. In that small pause, attention laid a thin film over the day. Not sharp, not yet, just enough to make the edges of things glint. The fluorescent tubes hummed with that particular electrical anxiety that always sounded to Keanu like a hive thinking about something. He looped the chin strap of his helmet over the grip, preferring the ease for a short roll to the exit, and took 2 slow steps toward the open lane. The booth sat to the right like a small control tower for a world nobody celebrated, a little glass box that made one man feel like he measured all the comings and goings in a city that mostly ignored him. The attendant's name tag caught the light. Greg, the threadbare embroidery barely visible through a smear of what might have been grease or old coffee. Greg had taken the sunglasses off completely now. They hung crookedly from his shirt collar. He tapped the touchpad next to the gate in a way that made the action loud, like jabbing an exclamation point at the end of a sentence. "Clock's ticking," he said, glancing theatrically at the sign as if he had personally negotiated the policy with the city. "You're at what, 11? 12? Don't make me charge you for standing around, man." Keanu reached into his jacket and pulled out the stub the machine had spit at him when he rolled in. An ugly little rectangle with ragged edges and a barcode that looked like it had been printed through a hangover. He held it up with a faint smile that was not a smile so much as an offering. "We can do this kindly. I'll be out under 15, he said. No edge, just a line laid down straight. He could have said sir. He chose not to because the word would have been too heavy here. An extra brick on a small table that did not need to bear weight. Greg's eyes flicked past the ticket to the motorcycle, then back to Keanu's face, and something like annoyance warmed into derision. "Yeah, well, if you're gonna move, move. If not, I'll start the meter. I do this by the book." It was a funny sentence, because the clipboard lying behind his elbow bent from years of impact under a coffee cup was blank, its top sheet curled and unmarked. Doing it by the book meant whatever the man said it meant at that exact minute he said it, and everyone knew it. Keanu let a breath leave him slowly, felt it uncurl his shoulders a fraction. "By the book is good," he said, eyes resting calmly on Greg's. "The book says 15 free." He checked the wall clock. Its second hand jittered forward in tiny ticks. A small red promise that nobody cared about. He had been in the garage just under 6 minutes by his watch. "I won't waste your time," he added. It was both reassurance and a hint of a boundary. Two edges of one tool used to open stubborn things. Greg's mouth chewed on nothing for a second. Then he leaned out farther, forearms folding over the sill. Close up. The man smelled faintly of cheap citrus cleaner and something mentholated. A radio played low behind him. The DJ's voice, a syrupy patter, poured over a song that sounded like a song you put on when you did not care what song was on. "You know what I hate," Greg said, like a man remembering a point he had been saving for the right audience. "Guys who think time bends around them. You rich types. You got that look like the rules are for other people and the bill always gets taken care of." This was the place where an argument could ignite. He could feel the room lean toward it, the way people in a restaurant lean toward a table where voices have just bumped the volume up. He could hear the elevator doors open and close somewhere, and imagine the person inside stepping out, smelling the tension like burnt sugar and deciding to walk faster to avoid it. The sentence about rich types had landed on something like a tripwire. Not because of insult, but because of laziness. Keanu was not offended. He was tired of cliches. He thought of the underlined line in Meditations, thought of his own not-so-great days, thought of all the times he had been late and forgiven by chance instead of by virtue. He let the thought pass. There was no reason to pick it up now. "I get it," he said, and he meant it in a general way. "The way you mean I've seen how people treat you without saying I've seen it from the outside. I'll move now." He nodded at the gate, at the button that would begin cooperation where friction had started to form. "All good." The attendant looked at the gate controls as if measuring the weight of magnanimity. He could push the button, wave the man through, be the hero of his own tiny movie. But then something in his face changed. Resentment's small pilot light catching. He straightened, tossed his head minutely and said, "Just so you know, I can start the charge if I think you're gaming it. Don't play with me." It was an odd flex, the kind you aim at strangers to see if they share your language. Keanu nodded once, calmly. "Not playing," he said. He walked back to the motorcycle, lifted the helmet, settled it with practiced economy, and swung his leg over. The seat hugged his weight in a familiar way that made him feel himself a little more. He thumbed the ignition. The engine caught with a smooth, contained growl that filled the garage's ribcage without punching it. He looked left, checked the lane, rolled the bike forward at a walking pace. The booth window framed Greg's face in an awkward portrait, collar tugged by the weight of his sunglasses, one eyebrow drawn down in a line of effort that should have been saved for something real. Greg's hand hovered over the button, then went down sharply with the flourish of someone stamping a document that had been waiting for his authority. The gate arm rose obediently, white and red stripes climbing like a promise. Keanu eased toward it, eyes soft, clutch light, balance absolute. He nodded with that same small offering of thanks he gave to baristas and janitors and strangers holding doors in buildings he did not love but had to visit. Greg did not nod back. He was busy smirking at his reflection in the little black rectangle of the control panel, the way people practice being the version of themselves they can stand. Right before the front tire crossed under the arm, Greg spoke again, voice pitched to catch in the acoustic throat of the garage and scratched down its length. "Next time, move faster. This ain't your personal showroom." The sentence carried nothing new but arrived heavy with the intention to mark. Keanu did not bite. He let the bike drift another foot, stopped a moment, and turned his head so the visor hid his eyes while his body spoke plainly. Not aggression, not retreat, simply the weight of a man who would not be moved by a cheap shove. He could feel his heart choose not to climb. He thought, not for the first time, that patience is not the absence of power but a particular way of carrying it. The gate hung above him as if paused mid-breath. He rolled forward one more foot, then another, small increments building a line toward the sunlit rectangle beyond. Behind him, the elevator doors sighed open again. A woman in a blue blazer stepped out, heels clicking, phone to ear, a bag at her elbow. She glanced at the tableau, bike, booth, man, and decided it was not her problem. As she passed, she tossed a reflexive public smile toward civility and got nothing back. Greg's attention had snapped to the radio because a traffic update was running, and he loved those. They made him feel like he was plugged into the city's bloodstream. Crash on eastbound 3rd, 2 lanes closed near. He turned the knob up a notch, looked away from the gate just long enough for his hand to forget where it was. Keanu's throttle hand was calm, ready. The arm was still up. The air felt like it was holding something fragile between two fingers, waiting. The gate's arm quivered slightly in the stale circulation like a shrug it had learned from years of being raised and dropped, a silent metronome for thousands of tiny departures. Keanu eased forward, the motorcycle gliding with the straight-backed grace of a thought carried to its end. The sun outside painted a bright four-sided promise on the concrete just beyond the shadow line, and he rode toward it with the patience of a person who knew promise was just light until you touched it. Greg's eyes, still turned toward the radio, ticked back at the last second to the panel, and he jabbed a second button in that overconfident way people use when they like the sound of their own certainty more than the quiet result of correct action. He meant to be efficient. Press, raise, lower. He wanted the arm to drop theatrically right after the back wheel cleared, to punctuate his control, to show the next driver he was awake at his post. But his thumb landed not on the clean square of down but on the slim toggle of override, a small stick that lived for emergencies and punished clumsy hands. The arm, trained to obey a single logic, interpreted the careless command as drop now. Not after a breath, not after a glance, not after a human adjustment, but now. There was a bright mechanical clack like a small door slamming in an empty house, and the arm started to descend. Keanu was already under it. Front wheel past the threshold, rear tire a split second away. He felt the twitch of motion above his shoulder and, without panic, without the small shouts people make to themselves, he rolled half a degree more throttle and brought the back wheel out with a kind of fluid precision that is not heroic so much as honest. The tip of the arm brushed the back of his helmet like a warning, a gentle tap with a ruler from a teacher that liked him but had to maintain standards. The arm kept descending with idiot confidence, and because the universe enjoys symmetry, there it met not the road or the asphalt or the shoulder of a polite motorcyclist but the polished, tender hood of the silver sedan parked just behind the booth, the one lined up like a loyal dog waiting for a whistle. The rounded metal bar didn't punch through anything. It wasn't that kind of arm, but it scraped and then thunked into a position that created a new horizontal truth, a white and red stripe pressed into metallic paint. A long, quick scar in a color someone had chosen from a catalog labeled premium. The first sound was not the scrape. It was the gasp that men make when they realize they have wound the string too tight, and the knot is in their own shoelaces. Greg's mouth opened on a word that did not arrive. He lunged out of the booth with startling grace for a man who had practiced slouching. Coffee went with him, unaware it had been released, and obeyed gravity as faithfully as the arm had obeyed electricity. Brown rain spattered down the hood in little solar systems of regret. No, 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 he said, not to a person but to the air, which could not help him. He grabbed the arm with both hands and tried to lift it back as if it were a stubborn window. The arm flexed a fraction and shivered in his hands but did not move. The override had told the system to hold its opinion. He darted back to the panel and pressed down as if the universe were about to respect sequence and not state. The panel blinked at him with its indifferent green. He pressed up. The panel considered this new suggestion and, after a beat of cruel bureaucracy, decided to allow a slow, reluctant rise. The arm lifted, scraping once more as it left, the sound like negative applause. A silver-white scar gleamed on the hood with the brightness that only fresh damage wears. It was long, straight, and undeniable, and it had the strange, mean beauty of lines that say I am real and you cannot pretend otherwise. The garage had 6 cars in it besides Keanu's motorcycle and Greg's newly christened sedan. 3 were empty and would provide no commentary. The delivery van had a driver perched inside fiddling with paperwork, and when he heard the scrape and thunk and looked up to see a man in a grey work shirt swearing at a gate arm labeled with a safety sticker, his face performed that quick neutral flipbook strangers do when they are deciding whether laughter is worth the price of cruelty. He settled on witness face, curious, alert, pleased to not be involved. The woman in the blue blazer had reached the ticket machine at the exit and was standing with her phone in the crook of her neck, thumb balanced over the screen camera without pressing record yet. Her instinct seeing content before morality offered an opinion. Another car came down the ramp, a small hatchback giving off the sleepy, slightly hungry aura of a graduate student, and paused at the tableau, idling with the open curiosity of people who are not yet late. And then there was Keanu, straddling his motorcycle just beyond the threshold of shadow, the back wheel now in warm light, the front wheel a toe shy of the sun. He turned his head slightly so that his visor showed only the garage, and his attention went to a place just past Greg, to that silver scar that looked like a lesson. Greg's next noise was not a word either. It was an elongated sound of disbelief that slid toward rage and got stuck in embarrassment's teeth. He looked up and saw Keanu looking, not gloating, not pitying, just looking, and he recoiled with an instinct as old as middle school. "What are you staring at?" he snapped, voice pitching up into a register that made the word "you" sound like the smallest trap. Keanu had been called 1,000 names by 1,000 people, and most of them had not stuck to him because he did not give them a surface to stick to. He lifted his left hand slowly off the clutch and opened his palm in a signal as old as roads. "Ease, friend. You okay?" he asked, the two words carrying the exact amount of concern that could be offered without lie. Greg flushed, whether from heat or shame or the menthol in his cologne, and shoved his sunglasses up the bridge of his nose so he could hide in their idea of privacy. "Fine," he said automatically, the universal syllable of men who are not fine at all. He looked over his shoulder and saw the woman's phone tilt to record and heard the delivery van driver's quick, involuntary chuckle pretend to be a cough. He understood suddenly, all at once, that the story of this minute would not be his to write. No one would remember the nuance of how incompetent gate arms could be, or the fact that the emergency toggle sat too close to the daily button, or that the hood had probably needed buffing anyway. They would remember a line. The attendant who yelled dropped the gate on his own car. "The curvature of humiliation is a physics problem they do not teach you in school." He swallowed. Keanu could have left in that breath. The arm was up again, the way clear. But some part of him believed that endings mattered more than exits. He stayed. He let the bike idle and leaned a tiny degree toward the booth and said, in a tone that was not sympathy and not scold and therefore had a tiny chance of being heard, "Sometimes it pays to be patient." He did not put his name in the sentence. He did not put the man's mistake in it either. He put only the idea, as if he were leaving a tool on a workbench near someone else's project and hoping they would see that it fit the job better than the hammer they were holding. Greg stared at him, eyes hidden again, the small muscles in his jaw tugging at a future argument. He looked at the hood, at the line that would not be soothed by denial, then back at Keanu, a stranger who had been inconvenient in a way that had drawn a border he could not cross without stepping on his own dignity. There were at least 4 ways the scene could swing: anger with violent gestures, apology with its own humiliations, bureaucracy with a call to a supervisor, or the awkward peace that happens when adults remember that the world is not waiting to judge them as hard as they are judging themselves. Greg cleared his throat, a sound like rebooting. "Just go," he said, voice flat. He glanced at the woman and the van and the hatchback and found in the tableau a jury properly empaneled. He did not look back at the hood because he already knew it would be there when his eyes returned, and he was not yet ready to negotiate with the truth. Keanu nodded once, then twice, one nod for the request, one for the man behind it. He rolled the throttle gently and fed the clutch. The bike moved with patient inevitability into the brighter rectangle, the front tire crossing the line that separated Cool Echo from Warm Street. The garage exhaled, but not completely. The air behind him still held the shape of a moment that had not finished unfolding. He let the motorcycle roll another foot, then stopped in that small strip of shade where above-ground light met underground calculation and waited just half a beat. Just long enough to feel whether the story wanted one more sentence. The city outside the garage was already awake enough to ignore itself. Keanu eased the bike to the curb a half-block down, set the stand, and took a seat at a small corner cafe with the particular patience of someone who knows his exit is not just a change of place but a change of temperature. He ordered a black coffee, nodded thanks, and sat by the window that framed the garage mouth like a stage. He did not intend to watch. He intended to give his breath something to do that was not correcting anyone, but observation can be a kind of mercy if it does not demand judgment, and he let his eyes rest on the rectangle of shadow where tiny human routines argued with their own importance. The first sip of coffee tasted like a good apology. strong, unadorned, nothing extra. He felt the caffeine rise through his chest in a thin, steady line and thought again about the sentence he had underlined by proxy in Meditations, the one someone else had underlined years ago and he had inherited. Control is here, not there. The silver sedan's hood glinted briefly in a slice of sun as the arm lifted for another car, and the scar threw a narrow white scream of reflected light across the booth glass. Even from here, he could sense how a single mistake remapped a day. He did not savor it. He did not despise it. He let it exist. Greg emerged from the booth twice in 10 minutes. The first time, he walked around the car with his hands pressed flat to his thighs, half bent like a man trying to look serious for a camera he despised. He ran 2 fingers lightly along the new line, then looked at them as if scratches left residue you could wash off. He pulled his phone out, took photos from 3 angles, then lifted the phone higher and took another with his mouth tight. The second time he came out on the phone, voice held down to that harsh whisper people use when they want to sound in control to a person in authority without letting the eavesdroppers hear the shape of their fear. He paced a short figure 8, gestured toward the gate with 2 quick chops, turned to face the street and then the car and then the panel, narrating a story to whichever manager or co-worker his day now belonged to. Keanu could not hear the words in any reliable way, but he knew their outline, the finger-pointing tilt of the head, the way he flattened his free hand like a blade and slid it through the air toward his own car. These were grammar, not gesture. When he pivoted and saw the cafe window, his eyes snagged on Keanu's silhouette and stuck there with a magnetic force of blame searching for metal. Greg took 2 steps toward the sidewalk, stopped at the edge of his territory like a dog reminded by an invisible fence, and lifted his chin by half a stubborn inch. The phone pressed hard to his ear now, the voice on the other end fat with authority, and whatever was said there turned Greg's shoulders into a rough line. He pointed again, this time past the garage and toward Keanu like a man naming a cause, and then he listened, and then he nodded in that small, miserable, repetitive way that means the only available answer is yes. It took 6 minutes for a supervisor to arrive, which is both quick and forever, depending on who is counting. The supervisor wore the same gray shirt, but hers was clean, the logo crisp, and she moved with the compact, professional energy of someone who had been the 15-minute grace period for other people's mistakes long enough to know when to cut it to 10. She spoke to Greg in the booth with a window only half open, and their faces made mirror shapes of insistence and apology and policy. Then she stepped out and looked at the hood, and her mouth made a shape that people reserve for new dents and old lies. She nodded once to the truth in the metal, then turned and followed Greg's subtle chin thrust toward the cafe, not because a culprit sat there. Keanu had done nothing wrong and everyone knew it, even the part of Greg that needed to believe otherwise, but because a story is not finished until all of its nouns have been pointed at. Keanu saw them start across the sidewalk together, and he felt the familiar internal rearrangement he did not dramatize. An inventory of tone, of phrases that did not escalate, of ways to be transparent without volunteering to be the surface others wrote on. He set the cup down, put his hands palms down on the cool table, and stood when they reached the door so that everyone's height was the same. The supervisor introduced herself. Melissa, firm handshake, eyes that had seen more failure modes of gate mechanisms than most people imagined, and asked, "Were you the gentleman on the bike just now?" The question was neutral, the word gentleman unstressed, and he answered yes in the same key. Greg stood half a step behind her, arms folded tight enough that his forearms made little ropes, and looked everywhere but at Keanu's face. Melissa's next sentence was a neat piece of responsibility, tasked not with blame but with making a chalk outline around what had occurred. "He says the arm dropped when you were going through," she said, chin tilting back toward the scar with more regret than accusation. "Are you okay? Did it hit you?" Keanu told her no, it had not. Not really, only a tap on the helmet, and it had landed on the hood. He made no gesture toward the cafe window where the shape of the scratch glowed like gossip. She nodded again, this time in relief. "Good," she said. "We'll pull the footage to make sure the system is working." The word system carried more than mechanics. It contained training, signage, human habits, and the thin membrane of luck stretched over the whole enterprise. Keanu felt something like appreciation for the way she framed it. Greg spoke then, the words coming out faster than the breath behind them. He stalled, he said. He was blocking the sensor. I told him to move, he took his sweet time, Melissa put a palm up gently and did not turn. Greg, she said, and the syllable contained a file folder of prior conversations. We'll check the footage. The hand lowered. She looked back at Keanu with the clean candor of someone used to both accusations and apologies. Would you mind waiting a few minutes while I review it? Just so we can document it correctly. He had a dozen places he could be that were not here, but he also had a principle he applied to invisible places. Stay until the important thing is finished, even if you do not get credit for it. He said he could wait. Melissa thanked him and turned, the keys at her belt ringing once like a chime of bureaucracy, and the two of them returned to the booth, Greg a step behind, talking under his breath at an angle. Keanu sat. The coffee had cooled a degree. He lifted it anyway. Bitter is honest, and honesty does not expire so quickly. He watched Melissa gesture to the screen, toggle a slider, lean in. He watched Greg lean over her shoulder and get pushed back gently by a finger she did not lift from the mouse. He watched a small arc of the day being drawn in pixels and then fixed to a line of text with a timestamp. A couple came into the cafe and asked each other without asking whether the pastries were worth their sugar. A bus breathed out at the curb and took on more breath. Somewhere above, a pigeon made the sound of a small hand stroking a drum. Melissa's shoulders settled into a particular stillness that can only mean the evidence had conspired against a story. And then she stood. And then she walked back out with the posture of an adult who would prefer to talk alone but will not make a scene. Thank you, she said to Keanu. And the thank you was not perfunctory. It shows the arm dropped early. That's on us. And she glanced at Greg in a way that did not need his name. There's an override press that should not have happened. The words override press lay neatly on the sidewalk without bleeding, and Greg's face went the color of the silver hood for a second, and then a brick beyond it. He made a sound like a coil shuddering back into itself. Keanu nodded once, only a witness to his own part, and felt the day shift toward forgiveness without needing to say so. In the booth, the printer started its little warble, and a strip of paper came out with the slow pride of a receipt. Melissa reached in, tore it off, and folded it. I'm going to file this, she said. I'm sorry for the trouble. He told her there was no harm. She looked grateful for the absolution, not because it changed what she had to do, but because it softened the air in which she would do it. Greg looked at the ground, then at the hood, then at Keanu, and then at something far away only he could see. The morning had not exploded. It had simply failed loudly in the small way people do when the world refuses to be arranged by their impatience. Keanu lifted his cup in a little salute to nothing and no one and felt the city's hum settle a notch. When consequences arrive, they rarely knock. They have keys. Melissa returned to the booth with a receipt strip and her phone, and Keanu watched the choreography of accountability assemble itself like an old routine that nevertheless demanded attention. She made 2 calls, one to maintenance, one to HR or its neighborhood equivalent, and her voice did that professional thing where it got softer as it got more precise. She opened the gate housing with a hex tool in a move that was both physical and symbolic, exposing the inside of the machine. A small city of wires, a motor, a circuit board stamped with a manufacturer's name that sounded like a cousin of responsibility. She pointed with the tool, not performatively but to ground the conversation in facts. Here is the relay, here is the sensor lead, here is the override line, here is the log port. Greg stood near the corner of the booth with his hands at his sides like a soldier in a picture on a mantle, a man uncertain whether moving would help or doom him. Every time she said override, he winced a microsecond after the word landed, as if resisting the temptation to rename it to something gentler. Keanu could not hear every word, but the gist was a melody even a novice could hum. The sensor had not been blocked. The footage showed the rear wheel clearing the zone. The override was depressed while the arm was at full height. The descent initiated before the bike had passed. The strike occurred on the employee's personal vehicle, which per policy should not have been parked in the immediate operational zone. That last note was a harmony he had not expected and did not celebrate, but it fit. Melissa did not add volume to anything. She added punctuation, period here, comma there, a note in the margin where training would be revisited, a signature line where something unfortunate would be acknowledged and then turned into a line item. Maintenance arrived in a van with magnets on its doors like temporary tattoos. A technician named Brad, sunburned nose, quiet eyes that had seen 100 tiny preventable disasters, slid under the housing with a flashlight and made the internationally recognized noise for "Oh, come on." He reset the controller, tested the sensor with a length of cardboard held like a magician's prop, and then pressed the override and looked at the way Greg's hands jerked as if the button were a snake. "Sticky," Brad said after 2 presses. He held up the little toggle with a gloved finger, wiggled it, watched it not return fully to center. "Needs a replacement," he continued, which was maintenance language for this as not entirely on human error, but human error chose the worst possible dance partner. He glanced at Melissa, then at Keanu, the way practitioners look at witnesses to test whether the truth will hold under a neutral gaze, and received back a closed, calm face that offered no absolution and no accusation. Brad wrote a part number on his palm, because he lived in both the analog and digital worlds and did not pretend the older one did not sometimes work better. "We'll swap it. Hour, maybe 2, he said. "Arm is safe to operate if you don't use the override." He put a point on that last clause not for Melissa, who understood it, but for Greg, who needed to hear it from a mechanic so that later he could not claim the machine had asked him to be stupid. HR arrived not as a person but as a phone call with a voice that carried the expensive calm of a handbook. Melissa listened, affirmed, clarified, then raised the procedural umbrella over the specific rain. Incident report, employee statement, system log, video clip, corrective action, coaching documentation added to file. Policy rode in on the slow horse not to crush anyone but to make sure the path stayed visible. Greg signed something that allowed the clip to be stored. He read it longer than necessary, then signed again because somewhere in him he wanted the drama of signing to feel like agency. He asked, in a careful tone, if the company covered damage in the course of duty. Melissa answered with a sentence he probably had suspected but hoped would change when said aloud. Employees were not to park within the apparatus zone. Damage to personal vehicles incurred by operator misuse would be addressed per the terms of the employee agreement. The words were just words until they collided with his face. Then they were weather. He asked about insurance. Melissa said he could file a claim. She also said, with a kindness that did not leak into pity, that the footage would be part of any submission. He looked down at the hood as if he could already see a denial letter reflected in it. He looked up at Keanu and managed to contain the urge to remove the cause that was not the cause. Keanu held his gaze and offered the smallest nod. It was not forgiveness exactly. It was an acknowledgement of how thin the rope is that keeps any of us upright. 2 things happened then that would have been on the nose in a movie but in real life just felt like the way coincidence behaves when people are paying attention. First, a patrol car rolled by slowly and paused at the curb. The officer inside did not get out. He simply lowered his window and asked in a neutral tone if everything was all right. Melissa stepped forward and said it was a workplace incident. No injuries, plenty of documentation. The officer nodded, looked at the hood, looked at the arm, looked at the men, and did the quiet math that life teaches cops about when attention helps and when it complicates. "Have a good day," he said and rolled on. The second thing was smaller. The woman in the blue blazer, who had hovered at the edge of everything like someone not wanting to be first or wrong, stepped toward Melissa and said softly, "I'm a lawyer. If your company wants a copy of what I recorded, I'm happy to provide it." She held her phone like a surgical instrument she would not use unless asked. Melissa thanked her and handed her a card and said, with that same professional lilt, that the internal footage would likely be sufficient, but external corroboration was always appreciated. The woman nodded and departed, leaving behind the figure of a person whose presence made accountability more plausible. The witness who did not crave a stage. A quiet fell then that was not awkward. It was the kind of pause that accumulates after system has been reset and before the rest of the day rushes back in. Brad closed the housing with a clean metallic click. Melissa put the receipt strip into a small envelope and wrote the incident number on the front with brisk strokes. Greg looked at the hood, squared his shoulders, and walked to the office door with the guilty dignity of a man going to learn exactly how bad his consequences would be. Melissa watched him go and then turned to Keanu once more. "I'm sorry your morning got tangled up with ours," she said. "Can I comp your parking?" The offer was almost funny in the way it tried to express something larger with something available. Keanu smiled a little. The way you smile at a child who tries to pay for an adult's mistake with a found coin. "It's okay," he said. "I was within the free window." He lifted the cup and then realized it was empty and lifted it anyway because the gesture did something kind to the atmosphere. Melissa nodded. "If you ever park here again," she said almost conspiratorially, "ask for me. I'll make sure the arm treats you like a gentleman." He appreciated the phrasing. She had tucked the word back where she wanted it, and told her he would. People began to move again, cars approached, the machine did its job, and the garage returned to its practiced amnesia. Keanu stood, thanked the barista with a quiet sincerity usually reserved for people who hand you your life back, and walked toward the bike with the sense that the day had already shown him what it needed to. He did not need to go back past the booth, but he did. It was not some moral lesson he intended to deliver. It was simply a circuit he wanted to close. He rolled the bike up the block and idled at the curb across from the garage mouth and waited for the crosswalk light because waiting is a habit you must feed if you want it to be strong when you need it. The morning had shifted into that mid-city rhythm where everyone moves at 95% of their capacity and imagines the last 5 will arrive when the day ends. He could have merged into it without leaving a mark. Instead, he angled the bike toward the mouth of the garage and coasted the short distance to the booth at a pace that made his front brake lever feel useful. The arm lifted on Melissa's light press and stayed up, keeping its promise. She stood at the window and nodded with the satisfaction of an operator whose domain had been returned to order. Greg was not in sight, somewhere inside the little office off the main floor. He was filling out forms and listening to words he would hate for a while before he accepted them as sentences that, in the end, had to be written. Keanu stopped at the threshold and put a foot down and lifted his visor so Melissa could see his eyes, and whatever passed between them was simple and sufficient. "Thanks again, we're square, the world continues." She tipped 2 fingers off the sill in a little salute that had no swagger and all competence. A sedan rolled up behind him, the driver patient, the radio whispering the news in a voice designed to make everything sound reasonable. Then Greg appeared in the office doorway, shoulders lower, face open in the way of a person after a meeting that was not devastating but not nothing. He saw the motorcycle and then the rider and then put the association together with a visible click of muscle. For an instant, Keanu watched the war of choices cross the surface of the man's face. Anger's last flare, denial's last bargain, and something quieter that might be the beginning of humility if given air. Greg stepped out, stopped short of the window, and looked at the ground while he spoke. He swallowed. "I shouldn't have talked to you like that." The sentence was not poetry, which made it perfect. He kept going, perhaps because the first admission had lubricated the second. "And I shouldn't have hit the override. I know that." He gestured vaguely toward the housing as if to apologize to the machine as well. "I'm paying for the repair," he said, and the syllables of paying sat in his mouth like something foreign he was learning to pronounce correctly. Keanu did not make him stretch farther for forgiveness than he already had. "I appreciate you saying it," he answered, even tone, so that the man would hear the words rather than the performance of them. Nobody was hurt. He could have added a message, "Be kinder. Breathe first. The rules you enforce on others will always find you," but Melissa would teach the parts of that lesson she could, and the rest would arrive or not arrive on their own schedule. Greg nodded, eyes pinned to a spot near Keanu's boot as if absolution lived there. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah." He lifted his gaze then and met Keanu's eyes and, for the first time that morning, looked like a person who might take a different path on the next small hill. Keanu reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the minor kindness he had decided on while the coffee cooled. It was a card, not his, from a small body shop 3 neighborhoods over run by a man who had once fixed a ding in one of his old cars and refused payment beyond parts because, "You've paid for a lot of other things in this town." On the back, Keanu had written a name, Manny, and beneath it 2 words, Good guy. He held the card out across the zone between their two small sovereignties. If you need an estimate, he said, he'll treat you right. It was not a rescue. It was not theater. It was a way of reminding the world that even in correction, there can be texture. Greg took the card without looking at it, and then did look at it, and then cleared his throat in the way of men who want to remember a number without writing it down. Thanks, he said, and the word had the weight of something earned, not grabbed. Behind him, Melissa watched the exchange with the faintest smile. Not at the famous person doing the famously kind thing, but at two humans who had navigated a moment without breaking it. Take care, Keanu said, visor lowering with the little click he loved for its honesty. He twisted the throttle just enough to lift the front tire into motion, rolled under the arm that did not flinch, and merged into the slow stream of street where everyone was trying to go somewhere that would make sense of where they had just been. He rode 3 blocks without thinking and then began thinking again, not about the garage but about the book in his bag and the underlined sentence and whether the person who had drawn that pencil line years ago had meant it for themselves in a moment like this or for someone else later when the world decided to recycle wisdom. At the next red light, a kid on a bicycle pulled up alongside and balanced with the unconscious grace of the young, looked over at the motorcycle and grinned. Cool bike, the kid said, too loud for his own sense of propriety and therefore exactly right. Keanu lifted 2 fingers off the grip in greeting. Thanks, he said. The light changed. He rolled forward, slipped into the day, and felt the small alignment that happens when an annoyance doesn't get to name your mood. Somewhere behind him, a mechanic would be unbolting a toggle and replacing it with one that returned to center every time. Somewhere inside a back office, a form would be filed and then forgotten except as a paragraph and training materials meant to save a future morning. Somewhere inside a man, the memory of a scratch on a hood would keep him from pressing a button too soon, and the feeling of having been seen without being destroyed might make him consider, at least once, that patience is not weakness but a way to keep the machine from bruising your own life. The city stretched, yawned, and went back to its favorite song. People in motion, learning or not learning depending on which lesson they wanted to hear. Keanu turned west because the light looked kinda that way, and because there was a bench in a small park where the air smelled less like coolant and more like grass, and he let the bike carry him there with the untaxed elegance of momentum properly used.